Greetings everyone, coming at you this week with something a little different from the usual. I've got a bunch of leftover wood from guitars I've made over the years, so I decided on building a pair of chessboards with it. Since chess is a big hobby of mine, I was really excited to rip into this and get going. Sit back and I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm using a pretty classic combo of maple and walnut for the board itself. I started by ripping those boards on the table saw and followed that up by running the edges through the thickness sander. This gets me a really clean joint for gluing, and also lets me slowly work my way to exactly the width I need the lumber to be. I wanted to make regulation size boards, and ultimately decided on a 20 by 20 board with 1-inch borders. I decided to do a big glue up of all 8 boards, and then cut them to size after. I have no idea how others make chessboards, but this way made the most sense to me. There was a bit of a discrepancy in the thickness of the boards. The planer made quick work of thicknessing the walnut to the size of the maple. This was the first of many glue-ups in this project. I underestimated the amount of time this project would take purely because of the wait time for gluing. I don't do much woodworking besides building guitars, and when you're building guitars, there's almost always something else to move on to while you're waiting for glue to dry. But here, it was really just clamping and waiting. I'm using pipe clamps for the most part. These are the best way to clamp up larger projects like this. I'm also clamping steel beams across the faces of the boards. This helps me to keep the boards flush with each other and minimize the work I'll have to put in leveling these boards after. I've got links to these and many of the other tools in the description. As with all the links and tools in the description, they're referral links, so they take you to the product pages. The products don't cost you any more money, and I get a small kickback from the sellers for driving sales on their websites. So thanks for considering that. I gave the boards 24 hours under clamp pressure and allowed the glue to dry completely before taking it to the crosscut saw. I feathered one edge of the glue up to get a square joint before taking it to the table saw then. I cut the square rows a little bit larger than they needed to be and fine-tuned the edges in the thickness sander. I'll take this time to ask that if you're enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit those like and subscribe buttons. There's a lot of effort that goes into these videos, and the woodworking is really only half of it. I try to release a project video every week, and hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications is the best way to keep up to date with new guitar uploads. I was nervous planing these rows across the grain because it's generally considered bad practice. This could lead to tear out and make a lot more work for me in the long run, but after testing it out on one of this offcut scraps, I decided to go for it and it ended up working out great. On the first board glue up, I clamped up all 8 rows together at the same time. This is the wrong process for my constraints though. It meant that I had to sand it flat by hand. I'm sure some of you would call me a baby for this, but I'm used to a certain lifestyle, and anytime I can use the thickness sander instead of doing it by hand, I do it. The boards are 20 by 20, and the thickness sander accommodates about 15 inches or so widths. Sometimes you can get away with wider pieces and just keep on rotating them for multiple passes, but this time the belts kept slipping and triggering the stop, so I just did it by hand. Moving on to the borders now, I've got this great stockpile of roasted maple and limba, and of course more walnut from the build. With these materials in hand, I decided to create 2 unique borders, but I didn't quite stop there. I wanted to take things up a notch in terms of artistry, so I decided to add some custom inlays too, which I've designed and used in previous guitars. I don't typically repeat inlays as I like to keep things fresh, but I was really excited to incorporate these particular designs once again into these new projects. It's a chance to bring a bit of the history into these builds, and I'm thrilled with how it turned out. In the end, I decided to go with one border made entirely of roasted maple, which gave it a clean and rich look. For the second border, I wanted something a little bit different, so I created a sandwich design of roasted maple, walnut, and roasted maple all stacked together. The contrast between the light and the dark woods adds a real beautiful depth and texture to the piece, and I'm really pleased with how both borders turned out. Each one has its own unique character, but both complement the overall design perfectly, I feel. If you take a closer look at the second board, you'll notice that I glued it up in halves. The reason for that is because it made it much easier to fit in the sander and ensured that the leveling process would require far less effort from me. Whenever I can shift my focus to the design aspects, like crafting and shaping and adding those artistic touches, rather than getting bogged down by the more monotonous tasks like sanding, I think the entire project benefits. It allows me to put more energy into the creativity and precision of the design, and that always leads to a better result in the end. The laser machine is one of my absolute favorite tools, and I make sure to use it whenever I get the chance. I love using it for cutting intricate inlays and precise cavities, especially when the project calls for that level of detail. Here you can see how the vine design turned out along the border. I'm really pleased with how it all came together, and it adds a nice touch to the overall look. When attaching the borders, keeping the board and its borders perfectly flat proved to be quite a challenge. To tackle this, I clamped it to a piece of MDF for stability, but it still required a lot of clamps interlocked in some awkward ways. I'm sure some of you watching might have a much better method, but in the end, this approach ended up working out for me. Once I worked my way through the grits up to 320 on the face, I glued an MDF backing to the back of the board. This not only helps stabilize the chessboard, but also minimizes any movement in the wood over time, ensuring it stays nice and solid. Ultimately, I wanted to add another layer to the board, so I used a piece of black limba. I cut it up to create a step at the bottom, adding a nice extra touch to the design. At this point, I used dowels to help line everything up, and they also add strength to the joint. You'll notice the inlay cavities on the bottom face. There was a bit of an alignment issue with the laser table, so I ended up using the other face of the border instead. These limba strips also serve a practical purpose of covering up mistakes. The unfortunate reality of woodworking is that mistakes happen all the time, but how you handle them can really make or break your project. I always try to clean up any glue squeezed out while it's still wet. The more you can remove at this stage, the less sanding you'll have to do once it's dry. The number 5 hand plane is without a doubt the most satisfying tool to use for me. It has so many practical uses in the shop, and the feeling of it shaving down wood is just indescribable. Since there are usually more efficient ways to remove material for most of my work, I don't get to use it too often, but when the situation calls for it, I jump at the opportunity because it's just so much fun. Plus, I think it looks pretty nice on a video too. These little finger planes are a fun way to add chamfers to an edge as well. They give you great control and really help refine the details. This last sanding effort is where all the clamping, glue cleanup, and general project tidiness really pay off. It's no fun getting to this stage and realizing that you still have a ton of prep work to do before hitting it with the high grits. One last leveling effort on the bottom here before hitting it with the oil. I'm using my leveling beam from Stewmac, which is also available through the links below, to flatten out any imperfections in the base. Before we move on to the oil wipe here, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for watching this video. If you liked it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with all my projects. All in all, this project was a great quick break from building guitars for me, and I really enjoyed the whole process. If you'd like to see more woodworking projects that aren't guitar related, let me know in the comments. I've got a bunch of ideas for other woodworking projects that I'm stoked to share with you all. But now I'll shut up and hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.